Today in From the Vault, we will be taking a look at a unique subject, not the dynasty and legacy of Augustus that we see here in the Arapakis, but the dynasty and legacy of Mark Antony. What happened to his kids?
Okay, so we'll talk about him in his place in history, his wives, his children, and then ultimately what happens to the children. Here's a famous image attributed to Mark Antony from the Vatican, and there's a lot of stuff to cover. So what's the main source for our knowledge? Just go to Plutarch's Life of Mark Antony. It's online, it's free, and that's really the best record of his family, his life. He's from a plebeian family. They say they're descended from Hercules through a guy named Anton. And essentially, if Mark Antony had won against Octavian, then we really wouldn't be focused on Venus. We'd probably be focused on Hercules, for example, as that family promoted that tie to that god. But it was a common feature in antiquity, in the Roman political sphere, to be prominent. You were then linked, at least mythologically, in a family tradition, to some deity. Okay, so his mother was a third country of Julius Caesar, third cousin of Julius Caesar. So these guys are related. And essentially, his father did win a triumph, but died, and then his mother remarried. And it's that individual, Publius Cornelius Lentulus Sura, who was one of the conspirators with Catiline, that was put to death by Cicero in 63, that seems to be the nucleus, the core of the hatred that Cicero and Mark Antony have for each other. And ultimately, in the prescriptions in the Second Triumvirate, it is Mark Antony that puts Cicero on the list, has him killed, and has his head mounted on a stick on the rostra where once Cicero then made his career as an orator. But why is that such a, why did they give him such a foul death? It seems that it ties all the way back to the fact that his mother's second husband was in turn put to death by Cicero. So, Antony, after the Catalonian conspiracy, his family was disgraced. He became very famous for being a, partier, drinker, accrued a lot of debt, fled to Greece, then got involved in a number of, let's call them Roman wars of fortune. He helps install various people into their, claim to a throne here and there, including Egypt. And then ultimately, he's going to get his way involved in the first triumvirate, that is with Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, through his later patron, Publius Clodius Pulcher, who was really a rabble-rouser, leading gangs of Rome. So we have Clodius that really gets Mark Antony into the sphere of Caesar. Caesar brings him along into Gaul, where Mark Antony distinguishes himself. Then Caesar sends him back to start his own political career in the service of Caesar. Then he goes back to Gaul, but then he comes back to Rome to help again politically as Caesar is getting into more and more trouble in politics in the home front. He's afraid he's going to be, and he will be charged with abuse of power when eventually he has to lay down his arms. And who's running interference all that time is Mark Antony. When eventually Caesar does cross the Rubicon and invades Rome, declares a civil war and so forth, he's going to now be appointing Mark Antony as his second in command. And the long and the short of it is they have a long history in friendship, but at times things do sour a bit. But ultimately, when you have the Ides of March in 44 BC, it's Mark Antony that takes up the reins. It's Mark Antony that decides to not flee because he thought he was next, but rather to take advantage of the political situation, pardon the assassins, kind of get his own power base started in Rome, And then he finds out he has to deal with Octavian, who's named as the heir of Julius Caesar, much to the surprise of Mark Antony. And then we have that second triumvirate in which there's a third character, Lepidus. But in the cleaning up of in the wars of putting down the conspirators and the assassins, ultimately in the Battle of Philippi, who distinguished himself the most is Mark Antony. But Octavian, heir of Caesar, is going to make a name for himself as well. And ultimately, the empire is divided between Octavian and Mark Antony. Mark Antony heads east, and Octavian stays in the west. And there are a number of factors and features. One is that in the east, then, of course, Mark Antony is going to come across Cleopatra. But of course, you already knew Cleopatra because Cleopatra was living with Julius Caesar at the time of his assassination. She was living in the gardens of Caesar in Trastevere. So obviously, Mark Antony knew her quite well. But he's going to frequent her in a more intimate way by about 40 or so. And meanwhile, in 41, one of his earlier wives, Fulvia, is going to be harassing Octavian. We're going to talk about the wives just shortly. But Fulvia is actually going to be, she's a strong political figure, and she's really giving a hard time to Antony, to Octavian in the Parisian War. So around Perugia is where there's actual, warfare breaking out. But she, say, fortunate for Octavian and even for Mark Antony, she dies on her way back to see her husband in Athens. So then a marriage alliance is formed, and Octavia, the sister of Octavian, is then married to Mark Antony to smooth things over. Then we have Actium. Then we have suicide in Alexandria, and that's the end of Mark Antony. Mark Antony, who again was frequenting Cleopatra already by about 40 or so, and we'll see having children, notwithstanding the fact that he was already married to Fulvia, and then is going to marry Octavia and have children with her as well. But we'll see how this all shakes down afterward. So let's start with the first marriage. Possibly, we do have some letters mentioning this early marriage. That's thanks to Cicero, certain Fabia. But the one that is official, and here's the guy himself with this prominent chin. There's Mark Antony. He marries a certain Antonia, whom he's going to divorce by 47. But he does have a daughter with her. And already talking about legacy, that daughter marries a certain Pythodorus of Tralles, so he's a Greek, a wealthy ally of Pompey the Great over in the east, moves to Smyrna. Smyrna is Izmir in Turkey today. And they have a daughter, and that daughter becomes the queen of Pontus and Cappadocia, whose descendants rule for generations. So that's already an early hint of that legacy that we can attribute to Mark Antony. So his offspring continue, and you can say in the east, flourish with their own kingdom. Fulvia. Fulvia is an aristocrat. Fulvia is much older than Mark Antony. Fulvia was previously married to two good friends of Mark Antony. We talked about Clodius earlier today. Gaius Scribonius Curio is another protagonist. Anyways, you think about these marriages in different ways. This woman was a powerhouse, politically prominent. There she is with a coin. Just think, the first living person to be on a coin in Roman politics was Julius Caesar. So here she is already with her own coinage. Think about the Perusian War. She was a major protagonist. Her ally in that case was the brother of Mark Antony, who was still in Italy. And she bears two children to Mark Antony, Marcus Antonius Antyllus, Iullus Antonius, and we'll talk about them shortly. But there she is on her coinage. What a prominent person. I mean, there are a number of great women that we can talk about in the future that were movers and shakers She definitely was, we're told in the sources, a huge influence on Antony, even directing him. Okay, Octavia, next in line, next marriage, is Octavia Minor, the younger. That's Octavian's older sister. And this marriage alliance lasted a good chunk of time. But as I was saying already before, Mark Antony is already dallying with Cleopatra and having children. But her famous children, we'll talk about shortly, Antonia Major and Antonia Minor, so the elder and the younger. And she had children from her previous marriage. So her other son that's very famous, Marcellus, the theater of Marcellus, who is at one point a designated heir of Augustus, but doesn't live to see that. She's going to be a protagonist. These children of hers will be big protagonists, as we'll see shortly. Cleopatra. So they know each other, we said already, from the time that Julius Caesar was engaged with her and had a child with her. That's Caesarion. You have Cleopatra helping Mark Antony in his own Parthian expedition. That was the intention of Julius Caesar before he was killed on the Ides of March. They had 3 children as early as 40. So that's right when he's, right about when Fulvia is dying and he's getting married to Octavia. Well, hey, he's having children with Cleopatra. These weren't acknowledged. This was not an acknowledged marriage. I mean, they were together. They acknowledged their children, the twins, Alexander and Cleopatra, and then a later child, Ptolemy Philadelphus. So we have these recorded figures. And again, the 2 of them acknowledge Caesarion as the son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, which was ultimately a big threat for Octavian, because Octavian was the adopted son. He's the great nephew of Julius Caesar. He is not direct bloodline as Caesarion was purported to be. So Octavia after the civil wars, and this is another smart, engaging woman, very shrewd politically. She was right there in the negotiations for the various alliances and the breakdowns in those relationships between Octavian and Mark Antony on more than one occasion. So what happens is Octavia is the protagonist, and she's going to take some of Mark Antony's children and adopts them into her family. But Octavian put to death Antyllus, that's Fulvia, that's the son through Fulvia, who's the elder one, so his heir designate. That's the one he had in his will, that's who's going to succeed him. So he's put to death. Caesarion's put to death. Who's left? The younger son, Iulus, and then you have the 3 children of Cleopatra with Mark Antony. They all apparently go to Rome, but 2 disappear from the record. Some people say they got sick and died. Some people say they were killed. Depends what you look in the sources. But we'll see Cleopatra Selene II does survive. What about Iulus? He's an interesting character. He marries the niece of Augustus. And then it turns out he's the lover of Julia the Elder. That's the famous Julia, the daughter of Augustus, who is eventually made to marry Tiberius. It's a very famously miserable marriage. He seems to be the one that, was able to make Julia happy. And for his adultery and for even a potential conspiracy to assassinate Augustus, he was put to death in 2 BC. And that's the end of that child of Mark Antony. What about Cleopatra Selene II? Well, this might be an image of her. It's definitely her on the coin with her husband. And her husband is Juba II, the son of Juba I, the king of Numidia. And you can see down below where their kingdom will be, partially in Morocco and partially in Algeria. And Juba II, right, he had been brought by Julius Caesar after he conquered Mauritania, was brought to Rome as a hostage and was quote unquote Romanized, right? He learned the language, he learned the culture, and then he's sent back to rule. And who does he send back to rule with? A member of Augustus's household, who is one of the adopted daughters of Octavia, the sister of Augustus, and that is Cleopatra Selene II. She became the queen of Mauritania, and that lasts until Gaius and then Claudius essentially absorbed Mauritania as a Roman senatorial province, and that kingdom is no more. But she was, again, educated, a protagonist, a great leader, a person of culture. And, that's just part of that legacy, again, tied to Mark Antony. Now, finally, we have two really big characters, Antonia the Elder and Antonia the Younger. So Antonia the Elder, niece of Augustus, elder daughter of Octavia, the sister of Augustus, and she married a certain Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. They had 3 children, and one of those children, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was the father of the Nero in the fire of Rome. And the daughter, Domitia Lepida Minora, is going to be the mother of Messalina, the 3rd wife of Claudius. So a cousin, direct first cousin of Claudius. Antonia the Younger, so the younger sister, Antonia Minora, actually, married Nero Claudius Drusus, the son of Livia, and is the brother of Tiberius. They had 3 children, one of whom is the famous Germanicus, the father of Gaius. And another one is Claudius, the emperor. So we have a lot of very famous people, Nero, Gaius, Claudius, 3 emperors. And who are they? So we see that Antonia the Younger is the grandmother of Gaius, is the mother of Claudius. Antonia the Elder is the grandmother of Nero. That's one heck of a family legacy, all stemming from Mark Antony.
Thanks for joining us from the vault. We have original lectures all the time. Just sign up for our newsletter at ancientromelive.org. You'll get all kinds of access to exclusive activities. See you soon.